And welcome back to Intermediate Conversation. Professor Kent Lee here again. We are going to talk about politeness in general linguistic context and also in a workplace context too. So linguistically, what is politeness? I mean, what do we mean when we say politeness? Something is polite. And as linguists, what do we mean? Well, linguists have a particular way of understanding, or particular ways of actually understanding politeness. It's actually kind of interesting. We'll talk about this and also think about how this applies to a workplace environment or how you interact with people from different levels, like your professors, and also cross-culturally and between genders, between men and women, between different cultures and different languages. We'll kind of sketch out maybe some of the theory and talk a little bit more about how this applies a little bit to actual situations maybe. So what is politeness? It's hard to define, but we'll kind of work through some different aspects that define politeness as far as linguists are concerned. So first, as a little linguist, we're going to talk about politeness, and one common component people talk a lot about when it comes to politeness is directness and indirectness. So what is directness? I mean, what do we do to be direct or indirect? And why is it that indirectness makes something more formal or less offensive? So that's one component of politeness. And for a lot of this, I'm going to, for some of this content, I'm going to rely on w10, as well as some other linguists. This is an area of what we call pragmatics. Pragmatics is the study of language use. And one linguist I'm going to refer to, I'm going to use some of her findings. It's w10. She has done a lot of work in how men and women communicate differently, as well as cross-cultural differences in communication. And some of her claims are actually a little controversial in the sense they're debated. Sometimes linguists debate whether she's correct, and there are social psychologists who will say, we don't agree. You know, w10 relies on observational research. Social psychologists would rely on different kinds of research and data. So they tend to disagree with some of w10's claims. So some of this is drawn from w10 and some of this is drawn from other linguists who've done work in this. So when we talk about, for example, cross-cultural differences and as well as differences in different contexts, we can talk about directness. What are some ways that we are direct or indirect in language? Well, we'll see some examples. There are specific linguistic devices or forms that we use to kind of make something more direct or indirect, and other forms of politeness. And I'll ask you to think about turn-taking. So turn-taking is in conversation with two or more people, and they take turns. So let's say one person is finishing a sentence. Their intonation goes down toward the end of the sentence. Maybe they also start slowing down a little bit, and the voice goes lower. And it's kind of a signal maybe that I'm finishing what I'm saying and somebody else can talk. And this is what we call kind of yielding the floor. So think about in Parliament, think about, say, typical British or European Parliament. There's a speaker who manages who gets to talk. And think of the former British Speaker of Parliament, John Bercow. He was famous for saying, "Order, order, order," meaning be quiet. I gave that person permission to talk. You all be quiet. The person who is talking has the floor. We say the floor. So there's the speaker and there's the floor of the Parliament. And whoever is speaking has the floor. They have the right and the permission to speak at that moment. So we're talking about yielding the floor or taking the floor in turn-taking. So sometimes, and this varies a little bit from culture or language or region, you might have a very short pause. Maybe people will politely wait, before they start talking. Maybe you can have overlaps. In some cultures they do this. One person, person A has not finished talking, but person B thinks that A is about to finish and B will start talking right there. And you may think that's strange, but in some cultures this happens. Or interruptions. w10 claims, for example, or in some linguists like her, will make certain claims about who interrupts more, men or women. Is it okay to interrupt? Who interrupts? When can you interrupt? How much of a pause do you have between turn-taking, between A and B? How much of a pause is normal? Shifting topics. Do you... sometimes we need to change topics. And we sometimes use certain devices, maybe intonation, maybe something like now let's get back to what we were saying, or anyway, or as I was saying before, or let's get back to the topic at hand. Sometimes we use certain expressions like discourse markers, we call them, like now let's get back. Now let's move on to intonation. So intonation signals things like turn-taking and topic and other information, as well as your emotions and agreement, emphasis, and things like that. Feedback or back channel markers. You're listening to somebody going, yeah, So things like that. Those are, you're acknowledging I'm listening to you. And I've heard that apparently, for example, in Japanese culture, it's very common to use a lot of feedback or back channel markers, and they're just saying, I understand you, I'm listening. And sometimes Western business people in the past have misunderstood that to mean, oh, I agree. And the Japanese business person is not saying I'm agreeing, I'm just saying I'm listening, I'm understanding you, I'm acknowledging you. Not I agree necessarily. So there can be cross-cultural differences here. Think about just, first of all, cross-language and cross-cultural differences between English and Korean, or between English and another language you know, or between Korean and another language you know. Are there cross-cultural, language difference in terms of directness, whether you're direct or not? So directness, for example, many times we're indirect out of politeness. Give kind of an extreme example. Your friend gets a haircut, new hairstyle, and it doesn't look very good. Your friend says, hey, what do you think? And you go, oh, that's interesting. Now, if it actually looks good, you say, oh, that looks beautiful. But if it doesn't look good, you can say, oh, that's interesting, or that's nice. Would you actually be direct to your friend and say, oh, God, that looks awful. What happened? God, it looks like you were attacked by a herd of wildcats. That is hideous. That is awful. God, you should go ask for your money back. You probably wouldn't do that unless you're really sarcastic. And in Western cultures, we can be sarcastic if it's people are on friendly terms, for example. But yeah, we would be indirect. So there are a number of ways that we are indirect. Can you think of differences in directness, cross-cultural and cross-language differences in directness, or other kinds of politeness, turn-taking? Do you notice differences in turn-taking between English speakers and Korean speakers? How we do topic translations, how we shift to another topic? Do you have to explicitly mark it or indicate I'm shifting to another topic, or I'm shifting back to a previous topic? Intonation, feedback, back channel markers, and other pragmatic differences. Can you think of any? Give you some time to think and pause the video and discuss this. Okay, now how about regional differences? If you're Korean, can you think of some regional differences in these pragmatic aspects? Are there differences in how direct people are, or politeness forms, maybe verb forms, or other expressions for indicating politeness? In different parts of Korea, different dialects. Do you think people in Seoul are more polite or more direct compared to people in Busan? Or are you aware of any regional differences? Turn-taking or topic, transitions, pauses, intonations, feedback, things like that. Deborah Tennant gives an example looking at American culture. For example, people in the southern U.S., like Texas, and I grew up in Texas, so I know this for a fact. In Texas, we tend to speak kind of a little more slowly, and we'll have a bit more of a pause. So person A stops speaking, and person B will wait politely until she knows for sure that A has stopped talking, A is finished. And there'll be at least maybe 1 second pause, half a second or more before person B starts talking. So you kind of politely wait for one another to talk, more often in Texas culture. And Deborah Tennant talks about the case of a woman who grew up in Texas, and then she moved to New York City for a job. And people in New York City are quick, they're abrupt, they interrupt each other, they don't wait. So she wasn't used to this. This Texas lady, she was not used to this. She had a hard time adapting to the speaking culture in New York City, where they're faster. They don't wait. Right as somebody's intonation is going down, and as soon as, like the very split second, they finish their sentence, or right before someone else starts talking. And she couldn't get into conversations, like in a business conversation. She really had a hard time. Because of this cultural difference, and people at the workplace thought, oh, she's really weak. She needs to take a course in confidence and assertiveness training. It was actually a vocal speech pattern, a difference in speech patterns. Are there such differences in Korea? Can you think of differences between American and British and how they talk? Australians, Irish, New Zealanders. In your own language, if you speak another language, if you spend time in another country, are there some regional differences in pragmatics and turn-taking and such? Let's pause in the video and just talk about it for a while. Okay, I would love to hear from you in person. It would be nice. These are interesting questions. Anyway, let's move on. Gender differences. Deborah Tennant claims, and she and other linguists have made claims that there are some gender or sex differences in some of these. Again, some of her claims are going to be debated, especially by social psychologists who study this stuff differently. I'm not going to say who's right, or because I don't know exactly who's right. But I kind of want your feelings, your intuition here. Do you, in Korean or in English or in your own language, if it's another language, do you think that, according as Tannин would claim, women are more indirect? Men are more direct in communication. Men are more direct, more assertive, for example. Now, Tannин is not claiming that this is biological. She explains this is a lot of it is cultural, how boys and girls are just raised differently, socialized differently. She considers it as sort of cultural difference, but anyway, she nonetheless claims that men are generally more direct, males are more direct in their speaking, whereas women are more indirect and they're more concerned with rapport and solidarity and harmonious feelings in relationship and in social interaction. Some linguists like her have claimed that men interrupt more, especially men interrupt women more, at least in English. Do you think that's true? Is it true for your language, do you think? Do men interrupt more? Do you see differences in topic transitions, intonation, how they use feedback, back-channel markers? So for example, I might have talked about this before, I'm not sure if it was in this class. So usually when you're finishing a sentence, your intonation goes down, signaling I'm finishing the sentence. Now, if it's a more complex sentence, or if you're saying one sentence and you tend to continue talking, you don't want to be interrupted, your intonation might go up. So it might go up. So for example, I was thinking about going on a trip to Jeju Island, but it was raining. So notice my intonation went up at the end of the first clause, then it went down at the end of the second clause where I had finished. And it's going up at the end of the first one, maybe for two reasons. One, I want to hold the floor. I'm signaling I'm going to, it's kind of a rising, continuing intonation. A continuing intonation. It signals, I'm not finished, I've got another sentence to come out of my mouth. So don't stop me. And that's one reason. Another reason why people do it is they're not sure. Like I was going to go to Jeju-do, like I was thinking about it, wasn't sure if I really could go, or I thought that the new professor was really strange, but then he's actually not too weird. So you're not sure. So it's been claimed, I think this is probably not controversial, that women tend to use this rising intonation more. Now in a workplace environment especially, it's not really good if you overuse it, especially for women, for men, because if you use it too much, you will sound in general like you lack confidence. If you're always sounding like you're not sure. So in your language or in your culture, do you think women use this rising or this continuing intonation more? This intonation that means I'm not really sure and don't want to be too direct. It can be a sort of indirectness. I'm not really sure, or not going to be so definite here. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay. Do women do that more in your culture? Pause the video and discuss this for a while. Okay, I would love to hear from you and some of your responses. I would do a Google form and ask you to fill it out, but I don't want to do that. I've still got to grade all the midterms. Plus, I am going to have maybe just a few minor assignments over the next in a month or so that are specifically designed to help you prepare for the final presentation, the final interview. So I'm not going to do Google Forms. I'm going to maybe have you from time to time do a short, like 1 or 2 minute talk that's designed to prepare you for the final. Anyway, on my slide here, I've got something called speech acts, and we're not going to talk about speech acts. That's things like, well, like statements or questions and suggestions and commands, and I'm not going to talk about that. But notice some of these show some types of indirectness. The wife wants the husband to take the garbage out. So she could use it instead of saying, would you take out the garbage? She might be a little more indirect. Has the garbage been taken out yet? Can you take out the garbage? Use questions. One is kind of like a fact-checking question. Two is kind of like a could you? And the could is a form of indirectness, we'll talk about. Are you going to take out the garbage? It's getting a little more impatient. I'm asking you to take out the garbage. Instead of saying, take out the garbage, I'm asking you to take out the garbage. Notice it's a little more indirect, the extra phrasing. I'm asking you. The garbage hasn't been taken out yet. Why haven't you taken out the garbage? And finally, getting sarcastic, very American or European. The garbage isn't going to take itself out. So notice the intonation combined with the statement, the observation, is sarcastic. So some of these used a little bit of indirectness. Could you? Are you going to? I'm asking you. Kind of indirectness. So we use indirectness in order to be polite. Why is that? I mean, linguistically, grammatically, how does it work? How is making something more grammatically complicated with like a could or I'm asking you? Could you? Why does that make something more indirect? I mean, why does it make it more polite? Think about that for a minute and talk. Okay, indirectness, we can define indirectness as, okay, linguistic definition, and don't worry if this doesn't sound interesting to you. It can be defined linguistically as something, a truth conditional statement, like I'm saying something is supposed to be true. The truth conditional, what makes it true, in other words, what makes this statement a true statement, it's kind of a philosophical, linguistic kind of term, or it's literal or face value meaning, what it actually means on the surface. What does this sentence mean on the surface, apart from the emotions and the context? It's not the same as the intended meaning. That's kind of indirectness. How does it work? Okay, let's look at one idea from a famous linguist named Robin Lakoff, and she distinguished different registers. So register refers to like different formality levels. There's formal, there's kind of semi-formal or informal, and then there is kind of kind of intimate or very friendly. Imagine a host offering, a host of a dinner party, offering, kind of formal, a guest some cake. You must have some of this cake. You should have some of this cake. You may have some of this cake. How do those sound different? If I say, you may have some of this cake, that sounds kind of odd, like, oh, I guess you can have permission to have this cake. No, you're going to offer. You're not going to talk about permission like may, unless the guest is asking, can I have some? Oh, yes, you may have some of this cake. But to make an initial offer, why don't you have some cake? Or here's some cake. Or the person is kind of emphasizing how great this cake is. You must try some of this cake. It's chocolate. Triple chocolate. You should have some of this cake. It's wonderful. Okay. What makes it more formal? The register or the formality level sounds a little more impersonal or non-emotional, rather than saying, this is awesome cake, you gotta try it. No, you must have some of this cake. Using modals like must or should, you must have some of this cake. The speaker is maybe going to avoid direct statements like have some cake. No, you must have some cake. They're going to ask permission, maybe, may I have some of that cake? Or apologize. Sorry for interrupting you, but it's time for some cake. Would you like to have some? So kind of an apology. It's not a real apology, but it's kind of for politeness. Or you say to your professor, especially in Korean culture, you don't say, do you have my paper? No. I'm sorry, Professor Higgins, but would you happen to have my paper? Would you happen to have? So notice the different things that make this indirect. I'm sorry, an apology. Would you, like the conditional verb, would you? And happen to have, not have, but happen to have. Kind of more, we call it happenstance, happen to have my paper. It's like, did you lose my paper? It's been 2 weeks. Did you lose it? Did you eat it? Did your dog eat it? Did you forget about it? No. Would you happen to have my paper? Politeness. Then semi-formal or informal, and even to more of a degree informal language, you're recognizing maybe difference in status or power. If it's more semi-formal, it's maybe more near equal status, like you and a friend who in Korean culture who's a bit older than you, for example, kind of near equal, or maybe your friends you're really equal, or maybe you're talking to, your supervisor at work, where there's a greater difference in status and power. So depending on the degree of distance in the status, one thing that we might do to be indirect is offering options. In the sense you make it look like you're allowing the person to refuse or to disagree. You're using certain expressions that seem to give the person room to disagree or to refuse something, or what we might call qualifying a statement. I'm going to qualify this. I'm going to say it's true to this degree, or my statement is stated to this degree. It's not absolute. I'm not being too direct. I'm going to kind of qualify or limit. I'm going to limit or mitigate it. And if there's a difference in status, this is kind of deferential. I'm deferring to the status difference. Oh, great professor, would you happen to have my paper? For example, you're deferring to somebody of higher status. So in a more informal or semi-formal situation, you tell your friend at the market, oh, it looks like we're in the wrong line. Instead of saying, oh, we're in the wrong line, you could say that, but it looks like we're in the wrong line. So you're qualifying or limiting it. So it looks like you're giving the chance to someone else to maybe disagree with the expression it looks like. Could you perhaps, let me see the newspaper for a minute. Maybe you're talking to your boss or something. Could you? So the could, asking for permission, perhaps. You're qualifying it with a perhaps. And let me see the newspaper. And then for a minute. Intimate or very friendly level is more focused on rapport, solidarity, equality, recognizing the equality, equal status. More personal, more direct, often more terse or concise and shorter. So whether it's English or Korean or any language, the expressions are shorter, more direct. We're in the wrong line. Or, hey, give me the paper. Give me the newspaper. So those are characteristics of direct and indirect speech, some of them. Now let's look at a theory of politeness by Brown and Levinson. They talk about face politeness, and this is going to be important when we talk about cultural differences in communication, including workplace communication. How do you manage politeness differently with people from different cultures, different language backgrounds, different social backgrounds? Linguists actually borrowed the Chinese concept, it's like the Korean concept of face or chaemyeon. In Korean, the Korean chaemyeon, which is a sense for recognizing the person's autonomy. They want to be left alone. They want to do what they want to do, and affirming their dignity or their esteem or their reputation or their goals. They're trying to do something, and if I interrupt them, I'm kind of maybe interfering with their goals and their autonomy. That person is working, at her desk. If I interrupt her, I'm kind of interrupting her autonomy and her goals. Or we're talking and I need to interrupt, so I'm interrupting her communicative goals. She wants to get somewhere with the conversation, but I interrupt because, I need to say something quickly. So this considers, of course, politeness levels and all. So we can actually define politeness also in terms of chaemyeon, affirming someone else's status or mitigating something that's a threat to their sense of face, their autonomy, their dignity, their status. They don't want to be interrupted. What are some things we do to handle face politeness, to recognize the other person's dignity and worth and their sense of chaemyeon or face? What are some things that we do in English, Korean, or another language? Pause the video and discuss this for a bit. Okay, one thing that we do, we call it hedging. So this is an important term, hedging. You'll probably come across this in some of your other English linguistics courses. That we talked earlier about qualifying or softening a statement, mitigating a statement. Imagine if someone came to you and said, hey, can I borrow your car? If it's like your roommate that you're really good friends with, maybe they could say that. Or your older brother, your sister, relative, maybe you could say, can I borrow your car? But more likely they would say, could I borrow a car? Because it's kind of a big imposition. That's an important thing, a car. Could I borrow your car? It looks like we're in the wrong line. Could I see the newspaper? We talked about that. If I were you, so using a contrary to fact statement, hypothetical statement, if I were you, I wouldn't do that. Hypothetical statements. These are kind of types of indirectness, and then there are also things that we would consider hedging. So a hedge is kind of like this kind of protective plant, a shrubbery around your property. That's a hedge. So the expression comes from that. In Western cultures where if you don't have a fence, you might have a hedge, a big tall shrub that forms a barrier to protect your property. So in terms of hedging and indirectness, what are some differences in politeness between English and Korean that you can think of? In other languages and cultures? And again, regional differences and gender differences. Are women in your culture, in your language, more likely to use certain kinds of hedges or forms of indirectness than men, for example? Different contexts with different social status Is there a difference in how you would talk to your professor politely in Korean compared to English? Can you think of some differences there? Can you think of some cross-cultural differences when you're talking to your, let's say if you're Korean and you work in an international company, how are you going to talk to your Korean boss differently than a boss who is from Canada or Germany? How are you going to talk to them differently in terms of politeness and hedging and indirectness? Can you think of some examples? Let's pause and discuss this. Okay, coming back, I'm actually going to give you, later maybe I'll give you some, maybe a list of some actual expressions, but I want you to think first on your own. What are some specific linguistic markers of politeness? Specific words, expressions, phrases, grammatical forms, in English, Korean, and or another language that you know. If you know Russian, Spanish, Chinese, for example. And think about in business contexts, for example, workplace contexts, another formal and semi-formal context, talking to your professor, for example. What are some specific linguistic devices, words, grammatical forms, other things that we do to express politeness, indirectness, hedging, to kind of refer to the different status, the way you talk to your boss differently than your coworker, for example. Face politeness things like interrupting. I've got to interrupt somebody. Excuse me, I need to interrupt you. How would you do it differently? You know, a boss or a coworker or somebody who works under you, or you need to apologize or something. How would you do it differently? So first, what are some specific linguistic markers of politeness? Pause and discuss this for a few minutes. Okay, now let's talk about workplace politeness. Think about some examples. How would you do these differently? What are in English and Korean and maybe another language that you know? Think about as many languages as you know, and different status differences. Talking to your boss, someone above you. Talking to coworkers and maybe kind of similar status, maybe somebody who's been there a couple of years longer than you, it's a bit older, or same status as you, and maybe you have some employees under you who report to you. You're maybe their supervisor or their team leader or something. So what are some different expressions you would use for these situations for different people? Asking permission to speak and express your opinion, maybe in a meeting where it's contentious, people are arguing, or a lot of very lively discussion and you want to get in and state your opinion. So you may have to sort of interrupt somebody because you want to jump in and say something. How are you going to do it differently if you interrupting coworkers or a boss or someone else? Apologizing for a mistake you made. Maybe something minor, you spilled coffee on the floor at work, or you really screwed up and your company lost an account because of a mistake you made, or you somehow infected the computers in the office with a computer virus, or whatever mistake, or you made a mistake. How would you apologize differently to different types of people? Asking, who took the food from my desk? My lunch, I had my sandwich here on my desk. Who took it? Responding to a rude comment or a rude question from somebody at work. And then maybe persuading others that your idea is better. My idea is better than his. He's stupid. My idea is better. You're not going to say that. You're not going to say, oh, he's an idiot. I was looking at clips of The Office, the American version of the sitcom, the TV show The Office, and in one scene, the boss says to employee right under him, he asks him, what is the most inspirational thing I've ever said to you? He's kind of maybe asking for a compliment. What is the most inspirational thing I ever said to you? And the employee says, don't be an idiot. In other words, the boss one time said, "Don't be an idiot," to his employee, and the employee thought,
"What is the most inspiring thing I ever said to you?"
Don't be an idiot.
"Well, that's the most inspirational thing he ever said." Not very inspirational, but that's maybe the best I can think of. Part of the humor from The Office, and I haven't seen much of it, I need to watch it someday, but part of the humor comes from violating these social norms. The boss in The Office is incompetent. He's kind of socially not competent. He lacks social skills and emotional skills. A lot of the humor comes from that. And some of the other employees lack these basic skills also. And that's where the humor comes from. Violating social norms can be humorous, or it can be offensive. So in The Office, it's kind of both. It's funny and at the same time uncomfortable. So it's a kind of humor we call cringe humor. When you cringe, you go, that's really awkward and uncomfortable. So you're watching the boss do something that's just so socially awkward and stupid and strange. And it's funny, but at the same time you're going, oh, you're kind of cringing. But it's funny when he's just violating social norms in a way that's awkward but funny, because he makes him look stupid and makes the other characters uncomfortable when he's like being insulting to others while trying to make himself look good. If you want examples of what not to do, I guess watch The Office. I need to watch it someday. In the next few minutes, spend some time to talk about these for a while. Now, discuss these questions. Think of different expressions. What are different expressions in English for different situations, different social contexts with different people for these kinds of situations? Okay, this has been sort of a linguistics lesson today, and hopefully we'll get into more about workplace situations a little bit, and then we're going to turn to actually looking at a company or two, talking about a real company, and not just workplace environment, but the company itself. I'll talk about maybe a company that I've come to like recently, and maybe ask you what you think about it. We'll do something like that. And I'll ask you to think about what kind of company would you like to work at, and start thinking about how you would do certain things in English, like interviewing and handling workplace situations. Okay, that's all for now, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.